welcome to the Construction Record Podcast. I'm digital media editor Warren Frey. On today's episode, we have more coverage from the building show in Toronto. Our first interview is with Veronica Madonna, the principal architect at Studio VMA. She's also an assistant professor at the RAIC Centre for Architecture at Athabasca University, and one of the participants at the International Architectural Roundtable held at the show. The title of the panel was Designing for a Lower Carbon City and Society, and Veronica explained to me how as society strives to eliminate carbon emissions, it's necessary to move from a sustainable mindset to a regenerative one. Here's the interview.
One of the things that struck me was you said we have to go past sustainability into regenerative, and maybe you could explain what that means to the audience.
Yeah, as we're kind of approaching, a lot of intersecting kind of issues that we're dealing with now and then thinking about our future, for our future for our children, we really need to start kind of looking at buildings and infrastructure and urban planning in a different way that kind of looks beyond sustainability and thinks about the positive impacts that we can make through our infrastructure. And that kind of really is where regenerative lands, and thinking about how can we use a circular kind of idea and circular city, circular buildings, so that, the outputs of one product becomes the inputs of another, and we can kind of continue that cycle to really form a more regenerative, not only environment, but also society in general.
You also mentioned during the panel that retrofitting is kind of ideal in a way, because we've got all these old buildings that we're not going to get rid of, basically. We need to make them, well, not sustainable, but regenerative.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the biggest things we can do and be most sustainable is to reuse our existing buildings. Not only do they provide cultural context and kind of a nice scale to the cities that they're built, but they have a lot of things that we can learn in terms of passive aspirations and aspects. And, they become kind of moments where we can continue to build upon if we kind of think about our zoning requirements and think about our density requirements slightly different, and even the materials that we use, and looking at materials that have minimal impact, like wood construction is very light, so it has minimal impact on existing buildings. But if we can maintain those buildings and look at ways to repurpose them for the needs we have today, we could really kind of do a lot of impact in terms of reducing carbon for the future.
And you were really advocating, and you're not the only one, I'm from BC myself, so I hear a lot of it, of mass timber. Some of you go into why this is such a great material for coming next 50 years.
Yeah, I think every material has its place and when we use it and why we use it. I think that's very important to consider. But, mass timber and the innovations that are happening in terms of the product itself is really proving that it can be used in a lot of applications. And so, not only does it has a lower embodied carbon in terms of its manufacturing processes, but it has a really good hand in terms of prefabrication, which when we think of prefabrication, it reduces waste, reduces site disturbances, which often becomes a problem in urban environments. But when we think about its properties as well as its lightweight nature and its carbon sequestration nature, there's great ability that we can, use it as a versatile product in our buildings.
Another thing you're working on is a future, I wouldn't say without cars, but with less cars. So you cited specifically, I don't know if it was a garage, but it was a structure that had plates for cars now, but then they can become housing later, which just isn't what happens right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really our responsibility to think about how we can design buildings today, but for the future. And adaptability and flexibility is really key. And so thinking about, what that means in terms of our structural systems, what that means in terms of our floor plates, and even our uses. So if we can kind of think about where are trends happening in the future, and think about how we can design our buildings today to kind of, transcend that is critical, I think, in terms of just thinking about, the carbon strategy in the future.
And you also cited some stuff you're actually working on. There was one at George Brown College, I believe, and there was another one that's a Honeybee Research Centre. So we can talk about those two.
Yeah, so both projects were projects that I worked on when I was working with Montgomery Sisam Architects, and really those projects were about considering holistic ideas of buildings on two very different scales. The Limberlost Place for George Brown College is a tall mass timber building designed for academic use in the city, and that building is really kind of demonstrating the abilities of mass timber and demonstrating what building form can do and how we can really preserve energy. The Honeybee Research Centre is on a different scale, different location, different site, and that one is about talking about its connection to our ecosystems and the importance that we have to remember that every time we build a building, we're disrupting our local ecosystems, and so we need to think about how can we give back in those ways.
And you also talked about, and I've heard a lot about BIM, but I've never heard of a simulated wood building before, and you're doing that with the University of Athabasca. So maybe you could explain how that works and what the benefits are for students and for researchers too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think moving into the digital world and thinking about how digital twins and BIM and simulated buildings can help us learn and become better designers and better architects. We're developing a lot of simulation buildings that we test, doing various different kind of carbon testing, but also thinking about how we could use the digital product that we're creating to learn from, and then think about how that kind of changes throughout time. And so if we do that and we start considering that in practice and thinking about how we can use digital technologies, we can have more purposeful design from the start that will in turn reduce waste and reduce a whole lot of things that we're thinking about, carbon and energy as well. So I think the place for BIM and digital twins and simulated buildings is really important at this point in time to kind of make our strategies and think about those correctly when we're in the planning stage.
And finally, this roundtable covered a lot of ground. One of the things you covered at the very end was main streets and how they can be more community focused, and how you've already got these 3-4-story buildings. You can add on to that with mass timber.
Yeah, absolutely. We have such potential, especially here in Canada, where a lot of our little towns and cities have main streets. And when we think about how those main streets now are, a lot of them are actually kind of not as active as they could be. When we think about the potential of densifying those, we can not only create more housing, more community, but we can start to bring people back to those main streets that were really designed and focused to have a kind of local and centralized life where, everything's encompassing there. And so there's great potential if we, consider existing buildings and how to adapt them and new materials and how to do that, and also our zoning and regulations.
Okay, thank you very much.
Great, thank you.
Our next interview is with Kevin Hutchison, an associate with Montgomery Sisam Architects, and we talk about a City of Toronto modular housing initiative where prefabricated wood-based construction was used as an urgent response to the need for housing for those experiencing homelessness as the pandemic shut down the city in early 2020.
You mentioned that you guys were basing what you did with modular off a West Coast. I'm actually from Vancouver, so I've lived near some of the temporary modular housing that they have up downtown. But this isn't temporary.
This is not temporary.
So what did you take and what did you sort of adapt for yourself?
So there were, the general configuration and the space planning, the kind of programming arrangement, we knew the mix of support and kind of common areas relative to the units and the unit kind of general configuration. So we had, I'd say a schematic design was 50% done, or there were some really good things to learn and evolve on. The difference between the BC projects and the Ontario projects, the BC projects used a lot of triodetic foundations, as I understand it, which required a lot less invasive site work. Because they were temporary, I think that jurisdiction was more comfortable with it. Maybe something they were more familiar in the more northern territories as well. In this case, we went with traditional footings. So from the footing up, it really is a different system.
And you use wood frame,
yep.
You said, which I had this first time, surprisingly, because you'd think it'd be a lot more in use, but this is the first time I've ever heard of modular being wood.
Yep. Yeah, so the benefits there are the sourcing is a lot easier, so it's commercially available all over the place, so it wasn't such an issue to source it. That's the real advantage there.
And you built this thing, as you said in the presentation, you said that everything but basically the tie-ins was already in there, including the fixtures, including the interior. So yep. How difficult was that to pull off, or was it?
I think in a factory setting, it's actually very easy to do. You've got all your tradespeople there doing the work in a controlled environment instead of out on site, so they can be coordinated like you would a vehicle assembly line. So there's huge advantages there in terms of scheduling and making their time be really effective and efficient. So the modules move through the factory floor. There's never really a slowdown. The risk that you have to mitigate is anything that might be damaged in transit, right? So that's, of course, when we're selecting finishes, we have to be aware of that. So I use the tile example as something. You're not going to do a tile backsplash in a wood frame modular unless you're willing to go in and patch and repair it, which in this case the timelines wouldn't allow for. Not that it's not possible, but you're going to have some damage in transit.
And speaking of the timelines, you mentioned, and the other people on the panel also mentioned, because they were part of the planning aspect of it, timelines were exceedingly small, which
yes.
is where modular kind of comes in, partly because of COVID, partly because of the challenge of having to supply things because of COVID.
Yeah.
There are a whole number of things you guys had to address in a very short time.
Yes, that's right. So the compressed timelines were in part due to a sense of urgency that everybody felt collectively. And I have to say there was a kind of great esprit de corps among everybody, that finding something positive to do in the midst of a pandemic that was terrifying. Everybody showed up those meetings with a problem-solving attitude. It was really remarkable, right? Everybody wanted to find some way to do something good. So there was great passion and interest, particularly in phase 1, and it still kept up to phase 2. That's a tough thing to keep up in the long term, but it was very successful. The Rapid Housing Initiative the funding had timing attached to it. And I think there was a sense of urgency of getting something positive done to demonstrate that there was some action happening. So on everybody's side, everybody wanted it to be a success, so everybody thought creatively to solve those problems.
And some of the building on site, you were able to sort of keep up at the same time and then work on one site when another one was slowing down, et cetera, et cetera.
Yep.
But some of the challenges you had were bringing them in. You had to deal with, let's say, cables or trees, stuff you wouldn't have to work on if you were working on it from the ground up.
Yep.
And also the site was, I wouldn't say it's your enemy, but it was something you had to account for a lot more than somebody working on a traditional site where you can just sort of modify it to what you got.
Yeah, I think there were two parts to it. One was the duration of time. The construction window was small anyway, so any site work takes a fair bit of time to be done. And in this case, we have less tools in our tool chest to solve grading issues, or we have less time available to us to resolve a duct bank in the wrong place or a gas line that needs to be rerouted. So there are certainly a lot of, you needed to be agile, but the tools available to you to respond to those problems was a smaller tool set than in conventional construction and a regular timeline.
But also you had things like the building inspector could come to the factory and get a whole bunch of stuff done at once, which would never happen otherwise.
That's right. So there's huge advantages in that regard. For us too, even on the architectural side, when we're going and reviewing for general conformance, I see 90% complete building on the factory floor. I'm not looking for all those things on site, which is much more difficult. So across the board, oversight and review, there's efficiencies there, and there's sight lines and angles that aren't available to you normally.
And one other thing that was mentioned afterwards during the Q&A was that there's sort of a level you can go to before you have to worry about all these other components, like people providing the social services within the building and that kind of thing. But you said you could theoretically build it up to 6 stories.
Yes, that's right. So from a code classification, we can go up to 6. There's a maximum 25 meter to the uppermost component of the combustible construction. Some sites, when they've got, depending on the grading, the grade or average grade determination is important there. We have one site on Dundak that has a very strong slope, and figuring out where to actually measure grade from for the maximum height was a real something we all needed to come and build consensus on quickly. That's a 6-story proposal in that case. Certainly possible to go up to 6 with wood frame construction like that. Modular is a little bit different in that the building will generally tend to be a little bit taller than a conventional stick build because you've got a redundant joist in there. So you've got a joist stacked on top of a joist. So it'll tend to be a bit taller than its traditional comparable.
Okay, and the planning sort of side of things, they talked about how they had so much intelligence they were gathering in such a short time. I would imagine the same thing happened for you in terms of construction. So what do you take from these projects to your next mods, or whether it's for the City of Toronto or for somebody else?
Yeah, I think there was NRB was very good in that they downloaded a lot of information to us. So we were able to digest a lot. We had some experience with modular working with other partners as well, although in heavy steel. So we knew some of the dynamics that were at play. And phase 1, again, we built it and we got that feedback almost right away, just in several months, so we could iterate and solve problems or things that we weren't satisfied with. So the joint between modules was something we definitely evolved and improved in phase 2. Some of the space planning interior was a place where we got comments as well, where we expanded some of the common areas to enhance the programming that was available. We actually redesigned the suites a little bit further, adjusted some of our finishes. So there's nothing that we didn't touch, but only in light ways, I would say.
Okay, well, thanks a lot for joining us.
Yeah, thanks.
You can listen to the Construction Record podcast on Amazon Music, Apple Music, and Spotify, and on the Daily Commercial News and Journal of Commerce websites. Thanks for listening.